This is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this talk I would like to provide students with help as they begin reading the textbook for our course on classical Roman literature in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This is an English language course, so it's open to all students who are able to read at a high school level, but the textbook can be a little challenging, and students who are new to the study may have a difficult time understanding some of the terms that are used, pronouncing some of the words that we encounter. So I think to read through the text with the students and make some comments is really helpful to understand the meaning. In fact, I don't think it's greatly necessary for a teacher to explain everything and comment on everything. Sometimes just having the text read expressively by one who has already studied the text is really all that students need. So I'd like to read through and comment on the first lesson in Roman literature, and let's get started. The various races which from very remote antiquity inhabited the peninsula of Italy, necessarily gave a composite character to the Latin language. But as all of them sprang from one common origin, the great Indo-European stock, to which also the Hellenic or Greek family belonged, a relation of the most intimate kind is visible between the languages of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So it's important for us to note that when we talk about the classical languages and when we talk about ancient Greek and ancient Latin, these two languages are not languages that belong to separate worlds. These are two languages that have emerged from the same source, that is, from Indo-European language. And we learned about Indo-European language in the beginning of our Greek literature course. Indo-European culture is that culture which after, we could say as Christians, after the flood, the second of two races of human beings spread from Europe in the north all the way to the east into India. And this group of people is called the Indo-European people. The other group of people are called the Semitic peoples, and they lived from Mesopotamia west into Egypt. So two great divisions of the human race: the Semitic people, who we would identify with the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hebrews, the Egyptians, and so on. And then the Indo-Europeans, sometimes referred to as Iranians or Aryans, the people who dwelt to the north of the Fertile Crescent from Europe east to India. So these languages, Latin and Greek, both are descendants from a common ancestor, the Indo-European language. Not only are their alphabets and grammatical structure identical, but the genius of the one is so similar to that of the other that the Romans readily adopted the principles of Greek literary taste, and Latin, without losing its own characteristic features, molded itself after the Greek model. And we see a good example of this admiration of Latin speakers for Greek language in the person of Cicero. We see Cicero, who would be considered the master of the Latin language, a great admirer of the Greek language. In fact, he was largely responsible for promoting the study of Greek in Roman society in the time that he lived, from around 106 to 43 BC. Even sent his son to Athens to study as a student. So we see in the person of Cicero the character of this Roman who seeking to improve and make the most of his Latin language, looks back and admires the language and literature of the Greeks. Latin, however, has not the plastic or flexible property which the Greek language possesses. The natural faculty of transforming itself into every variety of shape conceived by the fancy and imagination. It is a harder material. The Latin language is not as flexible. It's stiffer than the Greek language. It readily takes a polish like metal, but the process by which it receives that polish is laborious and artificial. Greek, like a liquid or soft substance, seems to crystallize spontaneously into the most beautiful forms. Latin, whether poetry or prose, derives only from consummate art and skill, that graceful beauty which is the natural property of the kindred language. So Greece is like a beautiful woman born with natural beauty, hardly needs to do anything to make herself appear most beautiful, whereas the Latin language is like a woman born with simpler, less beautiful features, who really needs to work to make sure the hair and the makeup and the dress are all done perfectly so that she looks anything like the Greek woman. So that's how these two languages are compared. Greek is a language that possesses a sort of natural beauty. Latin is a language that requires great artificial work and skill to make it appear beautiful. Latin also, to continue the same metaphor, has other characteristic features of hard substances. It has the character of gravity or seriousness, solidity, and momentum or energy. Latin is a strong language. It is a fit language for embodying and expressing the thoughts of an active and practical, but not an imaginative and speculative people. But the Latin language, notwithstanding its nervous energy and constitutional vigor, has by no means exhibited the permanency and vitality of the Greek language. Now, just to make a side note here, we may wonder, why did God choose to present the gospel to the world in the Greek language? And here we can see a good argument for that. We can see that the natural beauty, the excellence of the Greek language made it the chosen language for the inspired scriptures of the people of Christ, the disciples, and the early church. The Greek language was chosen, possibly, we could argue, because it possesses a great natural beauty and is worthy of the work of being the medium by which the gospel would spread through the world and be studied and enjoyed for all time. The Greek language, reckoning from the earliest works extant to the present day, boasts of an existence measured by nearly 1/2 of the duration of the human race. And yet, how gradual were the changes during the classical periods, and how small when compared with those of other European languages, the sum and result of them all. Setting aside the differences due to race and physical organization, there are no abrupt chasms, no broad lines of demarcation between one literary period and another. The transition is gentle, slow, and gradual. The successive steps can be traced and followed out. The literary style of one period melts and is absorbed into that of the following one, just like the successive tints and colors of a prism. The Greek of the Homeric poems is not so different from that of Herodotus and Thucydides, or the tragedians or the orators, or even the authors of later debased ages, but that the same scholar who understands the one can analyze the rest. Though separated by so many ages, the contemporaries of Demosthenes could appreciate the beauties of Homer, and the Byzantines and early Christian fathers wrote and spoke the language of the ancient Greek philosophers. The Greek language long outlived Greek nationality. The earliest Roman historians wrote in Greek because they had as yet no native language fitter to express their thoughts. The Romans in the time of Cicero, again that's around the 1st century BC, the Romans in the time of Cicero made Greek the foundation of a liberal education and frequented Athens as a university for the purpose of studying Greek literature and philosophy, as I just explained. The great orator, in his defense of the poet Archias, informs us that Greek literature was read by almost all nations of the world, while Latin was still confined within very narrow boundaries. Of course, one of the reasons for that would have been the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century. At the commencement of the Christian era, Greek was so prevalent throughout the civilized world that it was the language chosen by the evangelists for recording the doctrines of the gospel. In the time of Hadrian, Greek was the favorite language of literary men. The princess Anna Komnena, the daughter of the emperor Alexis, and Eustathius, the commentator on Homer, both of whom flourished in the 12th century after the birth of Christ, are celebrated for the singular purity of their style. And lastly, Philelphus, who lived in the 15th century and had visited Constantinople, states in a letter dated 1451 that although much bad Greek was spoken in that capital, the court, and especially the ladies, retained the dignity and elegance which characterized the purest writers of the classical ages. We then have a Latin quote here: Greci quibus lingua depravata non sit, et quos ipsi tum sequimur, tum imitamur, ita locuuntur, vulgo etiam hac tempestate, ut Aristophanes comicus, ut Euripides tragicus, ut oratores omnes et historiographi, ut philosophi etiam ipsi et Plato et Aristoteles. Viri aulici veterem sermonis dignitatem atque elegantiam retinebant. Such was the wonderful vitality of Greek in its ancient form, and yet, strange to say, notwithstanding, it clung so to existence. It seems as though it was a plant of such delicate nature that it could only flourish under a combination of favorable circumstances. It pined and withered when separated from the living Greek intellect. It lived only where Greeks themselves lived, in their fatherland or in their colonies. It refused to take root elsewhere. And this is easy to prove from history. Just look at how little attention was given to Greek all through medieval history. It wasn't until the time of the Renaissance in the 14 and 1500s that the study of classical Greek was revived in Europe. It was avoided, really ignored for a very long time. The Vulgate established Latin as the official language of the Christian church all through the European West. And the study of the original language of the Greek New Testament was considered not really necessary because an authoritative Latin translation of the scriptures existed and was approved by the church. So there was not much motivation to study Greek, and where that Greek philosophy and Greek culture is not present, the language also slowly disappears or is neglected by the people. The Greek language refused to take root outside of Greece. Whenever in any part of the world a Greek settlement decayed and the population became extinct, even although Greek art and science and literature and philosophy found there a temporary home, the language perished also. There seems to be some connection between the Greek mind and the Greek language. The Greek language could not exist when the fostering care of native genius was withdrawn. It then shrunk back again into its original dimensions and was confined within the boundaries of its original home. When the Greeks in any place passed away, their language did not influence or amalgamate with that of the people which succeeded them. Latin, on the other hand, was propagated like the dominion of Rome by conquest. So you see that there's also historical influences on the languages. Latin happened to be the language of conquering Rome. And so Latin was imposed upon people all over the world, whereas Greek, while it was brought by Alexander to the east and south into North Africa, was already abandoned as the official language by the time of the Roman Empire. Latin either took the place of the language of the conquered nation or became engrafted upon the native language and gradually pervaded its composition. What that means is that Latin often was brought into new lands, into new cultures, new countries, and if it didn't replace the native language, it was brought into the native language. We can see this, in how words, even to this day, are still derived. New words are derived from the Latin language. The Latin provides better expressions, clearer expressions of ideas. And so the vocabulary is sort of taken over by the Latin language, even if the native language is retained. Hence, its presence is discernible in all European languages. In Spain, Latin became united with the Celtic and Iberian as early as the period of the Gracchi. It was planted in Gaul by the conquests of Julius Caesar, and Latin was established in Britain by his transient expeditions, that is, the expeditions of Caesar. And lastly, in the reign of Trajan, it became permanently fixed in the distant regions of Dacia and Pannonia. It is scarcely correct to term Greek a dead language. It has degenerated, but it has never perished or disappeared. Its harmonious modulations are forgotten. Its delicate pronunciation is no longer heard. But Greek is still spoken at Athens. The language, of course, exhibits those features which constitute the principal difference between ancient and modern languages. Prepositions and particles have supplanted affixes and inflections. Auxiliary verbs supply the gaps caused by the crumbling away of the old conjugations. And literal translations of modern modes of speech give an air of incongruity and barbarism. But still, The language is, upon the whole, wonderfully preserved. That paragraph there, when you read the text on your own, gives a really great summary of the differences of modern and classical languages, or at least modern languages and the ancient Greek language, how they're different. It's important to note those things. In English, for example, we don't use forms. We don't decline nouns and use forms to show relations between words. We use prepositions. That's why we translate Greek nouns with English prepositions and English nouns to capture the idea contained in the form of a Greek word. So that's one difference, is that we use prepositions and particles, whereas the Greeks expressed so much more through the forms of the words themselves. We use auxiliary verbs. We learn about them in classical grammar. We use auxiliary verbs in English because we can't express the ideas, the actions in all their detail that a single Greek verb can express without using a number of English words or English verbs. And then also it talks about the translations of modern modes of speech are not fluid and orderly like ancient Greek translations. The author says they're incongruous and they suffer from what's called barbarism, which is improper or the language of the uneducated people. Barbarism. Think of the word barbarians, right? The outsiders, the wild people. A well-educated modern Greek would find less difficulty understanding the writings of Xenophon, who was a philosopher who lived around the time of Socrates, than an Englishman would experience in reading Geoffrey Chaucer or Spenser. So if a helpful look at the languages, a well-educated Greek living today could read and enjoy the writings of a 4th century BC Greek author, while an English-speaking man today, living in the 21st century, would hardly be able to read or understand the writings of Geoffrey Chaucer, because the English language went through so many changes, whereas the Greek is so stable that even today, modern Greek speakers can read ancient Greek. So Greek has really endured the test of time. And again, we can see that the wisdom in having the New Testament composed in Greek because of this timelessness of the language. It's also interesting, as I say that, one other thought that I think is interesting that I'd like to share is that if we think of the Old and the New Testaments, the Old Testament was composed in a Semitic language, and the New Testament was composed in an Indo-European language. So we have both divisions of the human race present in the languages of sacred scripture. Never thought about that before. It's pretty interesting. Greek has evinced not only vitality, but individuality likewise. Compared with other languages, its stream flowed pure through barbarous lands, and was but little tinged or polluted by the soil through which it passed. There is nothing of this in Latin, neither the vitality nor the power of resistance to change. We can easily think of the difference between classical Latin and ecclesiastical Latin or church Latin, and see how much the Latin changed over just a few centuries. But there is nothing of this in the Greek language. Strange to say, although partially derived from the same source, its properties appear to be totally different. Latin seems to have a strong disposition to change. It readily became polished and as readily became barbarized. It had no difficulty enriching itself with new expressions borrowed from Greek and conforming itself to Greek rules of taste and grammar. When it came in contact with the languages of other nations, the affinity which it had for them was so strong that it speedily amalgamated with them. But it did not so much influence them as itself received an impress from them. It did not supersede, but it became absorbed in and was corrupted by other tongues. Probably, as it was originally made up of many European elements, it recognized a relationship with all other languages, and therefore readily admitted of fusion together with them into a composite form. Its existence is confined within the limits of less than 8 countries. It assumed a form adapted for literary composition less than 2 centuries and a half before the Christian era, and it ceased to be a spoken language in the 6th century. So the author is clearly arguing that the Greek language is a superior language to the Latin language. And I'm glad to hear that because I've always enjoyed Greek more myself. As long as the Roman Empire existed in its integrity and the capital city retained its influence as the patron to whom all literary men must look for support, and as the model of refinement and civilization, the language maintained its dominion. So as the Roman Empire stood, so also the Latin language stood. Provincial writers, that means writers from the provinces of the Roman Empire, provincial writers endeavored to rid themselves of their provincialisms. At Rome, they formed their taste and received their education. The rule of language was how the language was used in Rome. But when the empire was dismembered or broken up into pieces, and language was thus set free from its former restrictions, each section of it felt itself at liberty to have an independent language and literature of its own. The classical standard, that is, the Latin of Rome, was neglected, and Latin rapidly became barbarized. Again, Latin has interpenetrated or become the nucleus of every language of civilized Europe. It has shown great facilities of adaptation, but no individuality or power to supersede them. But the relation which it bears to them is totally unlike that which ancient Greek bears to modern Greek. The best Latin scholar would not understand Dante or Tasso, nor would a knowledge of Italian enable one to read Horace and Virgil. So even though the languages are related, it's not possible to read one because you know the other. Talking about Latin languages and European languages. The old Roman language, as it existed previous to coming in contact with Greek influences, had almost entirely perished. It will be shown hereafter that only a few records of the old Roman language remain, and the language of these fragments is very different from that of the classical period. Nor did the old language grow into the new, like the Greek of 2 successive ages by a process of development, but it was remolded by external and foreign influences. So different was the old Roman language from classical Latin that although the investigations of modern scholars have enabled us to decipher the fragments which remain of old Roman language, and to point out the analogies which exist between old and new forms, some of them were with difficulty intelligible to the cleverest and best educated of the Augustan age, or the first century BC, the age of the Emperor Augustus. The treaty which Rome made with Carthage in the first year of the Republic was engraved on brazen tablets and preserved in the archives of the Roman capital. Polybius had learning enough to translate it into Greek, but he tells us that the language of it was too archaic for the Romans of his day. A wide gap separates this old Latin from the Latin of Ennius, whose style was formed by Greek taste. Another not so wide is interposed between the age of Ennius and that of Plautus and Terence, both of whom wrote in the language of their adopted city, but confessedly copied Greek models. And lastly, Cicero and the Augustan poets mark another age, to which, from the preceding one, the only transition with which we are acquainted is the style of oratory of Caius Gracchus, which tradition informs us was free from ancient rudeness, although it had not acquired the smoothness and polish of Hortensius or Cicero. So 3 ages we learn of there, 3 ages of Roman literature. The Old Latin up to the time of Ennius, from Ennius through the times of Plautus and Terence, and then the time of Cicero and the Augustan poets. 3 ages of Latin literature. In order to arrive at the origin of the Latin language, it will be necessary to trace that of the Romans themselves. In the most distant ages to which tradition extends, the peninsula of Italy appears to have been inhabited by 3 stocks or tribes of the great Indo-Germanic family. One of these is commonly known by the name of Oskans. Another consisted of 2 branches, the Sabellians or Sabines and the Umbrians. The third were called Siceli, sometimes Vituli and Itali. What affinities there were between these and other Indo-European tribes outside of Italy, or by what route they came from the original cradle of the human race, which was, according to the Greek literature text we read, Armenia. This is wrapped in obscurity. The process by which these people came into Italy is unknown. One historian, Donaldson, considers that all the original inhabitants of Italy were of the same race as the Lithuanians or Prussians. The Oskans, evidently from the name which tradition assigns to them, claimed to be the original inhabitants. The name Oski or Opiki, which is a longer form of it, is etymologically connected with Ops, the goddess Earth, and consequently their national appellation is equivalent to the Greek terms auto. Sorry, there's a Greek word that I need to read here, and the text is small. One second, let me zoom in a little bit. Autochthones or gegenes. Let me read that sentence again. The name Oski or Opiki or Opichi, which is a longer form of it, is etymologically connected with Ops, the goddess Earth, and consequently their national appellation is equivalent to the Greek terms autochthones or gegenes, the children of the soil. That the Sabellians and Umbrians are branches of the same stock is proved by the similarity which has been discovered to exist between the languages spoken by them. The Umbrians also claimed great antiquity, for the Greeks are said to have given them their name from umbos or umbros, meaning rain, implying that they were an antediluvian race, a race that existed before the flood, and had survived the storms of rain which deluged the world. So the Greeks, the name Umbrians is said to have possibly come from the Greeks, who named the people this because they were the rain people or the flood people who lived before the flood. Very interesting tradition. Now notice that that's not coming from the biblical tradition of Noah's flood. That's coming from a Greek mythological tradition of a similar flood, a catastrophe that took place in the ancient world. This implied that they were an antediluvian or pre-flood race which had survived the storms of rain which deluged or flooded the world. Pliny likewise considers them the most ancient race in Italy. So there the author is talking about who the original inhabitants of Italy were. He says that there were 3 different groups of people, and to say something about their possible origins, where they had come from. The original settlements of the Umbrians extended over the district bounded on one side by the Tiber River, which is where Rome is located, and the other by the Po River. All the country to the south was in the possession of the Oscans, with the exception of Latium, which was inhabited by the Siceli. But in process of time, the Oscans, pressed upon by the Sabellians, invaded the abodes of this peaceful and rural people, some of whom submitted and amalgamated or mixed with their conquerors. The rest were driven across the narrow sea into Sicily, and gave the name to that island. So Sicily is said to be named after the Siceli people. And there's sort of a history of how they came to dwell on the island and why the island has that name. These native tribes were not left in undisturbed possession of their rich inheritance. There arrived in the north of Italy that enterprising race, famed alike for their warlike spirit and their skill in the arts of peace, the Pelasgians, and became the civilizers of Italy. Don't get this name Pelasgians confused with the name Pelagians, which refers to a group of people in Christian times. This is Pelasgians. Historical research has failed to discover what settlements this wonderful race inhabited immediately previous to their occupation of Etruria. According to Livy's account, Livy was a Roman who wrote a history of the founding of the city of Rome. According to his account, they must have arrived in Italy by sea, for he asserts that their first settlements were south of the Apennine Mountains, and that thence they spread northwards, and that the Hraeti, R-H-A-E-T-I, Hraeti, were a portion of them, and spoke their language in a barbarous and corrupt form. Livy's testimony ought to have some weight because as a native of the neighborhood, he probably knew the Hraetian language. Their immigration must have taken place more than 1,000 years before Christ, and yet they were far advanced in the arts of civilization and refinement and the science of politics and social life. They enriched their newly acquired country with commerce and filled it with strongly fortified and populous cities. Their dominion rapidly spread over the whole of Italy from sea to sea, from the Alps to Vesuvius and Salerno, and even penetrated into the islands of Elba and Corsica. Herodotus asserts that they migrated from Lydia, which is in Asia Minor, I believe, and this tradition was adopted by the Romans and by themselves. Dionysius rejects this theory on the grounds that there is no similarity between the Lydian and Etruscan language, religion, or institutions, and that Xanthus, a native Lydian historian, makes no mention of this migration from Asia Minor to Italy. Doubtless the language of the early Italians is unique, nor can a connection be traced between it and any family. But their alphabet is Phoenician. That ties them to the Semitic people. Their alphabet is Phoenician. Their theology and their polity refers to their forms of government, are Oriental. That means they're Eastern. Their national dress and national symbol, the eagle, was Lydian, and a remarkable custom alluded to both by Herodotus and Plautus was Lydian likewise. So there's a theory that the original inhabitants, especially of northern Italy in ancient times, 1,000 or so years before Christ, were actually a people who had come across the sea from Asia Minor and settled into Italy. And we can see, if you're familiar with the story of Aeneas, of Virgil's Aeneid, you'll know that there was a tradition there in the Aeneid that the Roman people were actually Trojans, and that after the Trojan War, some of the remnant of the Trojan people had escaped and fled and sailed across the sea and landed in Italy. Entering the territory of the Umbrians further south, they drove them before them into the rugged and mountainous districts, and themselves occupied the rich and fertile plains. The headquarters of the invaders was Etruria. The conquered Umbrians lived amongst them as a subject people, like the Peloponnesians lived under their Dorian conquerors, or as the Saxons lived in England under the Norman nobility after the Norman conquest. This portion of the Pelasgians called themselves Racena. The Greeks spoke of them as Tyrseni, a name evidently connected with the Greek word Turris or Tursis, and which remarkably confirms an assertion made by Herodotus, since the only Pelasgians who were famed for architecture or tower building were those who claimed a Lydian extraction, namely the Argives and Etruscans. So it seems as we continue to think about and work through this theory that these Pelasgian people came from Lydia, there's more and more evidence that supports that theory. And again, all that the author is doing here is trying to develop an origin for the people of Italy so that we can consider where that ancient language and any literature of that first era of Roman or Latin literature might have come from, or why it might be the way that it is. So we're studying sort of the historical development of the first era of Roman literature. Pelasgian supremacy on the left bank of the Tiber found no one to dispute it. Let us now turn our attention to the influence of these invaders in Lower Italy. As they marched southwards, they vanquished the Oscans and occupied the plains of Latium. They did not, however, remain long at peace in the districts which they had conquered. The old inhabitants returned from the neighboring highlands to which they had been driven, and subjugated or took control of the northern part of Latium. The history of the occupation of Etruria, which has been already related, was here acted over again with only the following alteration, that here the Oscan was the dominant tribe, and the subject people amongst them, amongst whom they took up their abode, were Pelasgians and Siceli, by whom the rest of the low country of Latium was still occupied. The towns of the north formed a federal union, of which Alba was the capital, whilst of the southern or Pelasgian confederacy the chief city was Lavinium or Latinium. The conquering Oscans were a nation of warriors and hunters, and consequently, as Niebuhr remarked, in the language of this district, the terms belonging to war and hunting are Oscan terms, while those relating to peace and the occupations of rural life are Pelasgian. As, therefore, the language of Etruria was Pelasgian, corrupted by Umbrian, so Pelasgian and Oscan is the formula which represents the language of Latium. But the Roman or Latin language is still more composite in its nature and consists of more than these two elements, not just Pelasgian and Oscan, but there's more. This phenomenon is also to be accounted for by the origin of the Roman people. The Septi Montium, or the Seven Hills, upon which old Rome was built, was occupied by different Italian tribes. A Latin tribe belonging, if we may trust mythical tradition, to the Alban Confederacy had their settlement on Mount Palatine, and a Sabine or Sibelian community occupied neighboring heights of the Quirinal and Capitoline hills. Mutual jealousy of race kept them for some time separate from each other, but at length the privilege of intermarriage was conceded, and the two communities became one people. The Tyrrhene Pelasgians, however, separated only by a small river from this new state, rapidly rising to power and prosperity, were not likely to view its existence without distrust and jealousy. Accordingly, the early Roman historical traditions evidently point to a period during which Rome was subject to Etruscan rule. When the Etruscan dynasty passed away, its influence in many respects still remained. The religion and mythology of Etruria left an indelible stamp on the rites and ceremonies of the Roman people. And again, notice how the author, by telling us the history of Italy and where the people came from and what the character of the different native groups was, we can begin to understand the nature of Roman culture, of Roman language and literature. The religion and mythology of Etruria left an indelible stamp on the rites and ceremonies of the Roman people. The Etruscan deities or gods were the natural gods of Rome before the influence of Greek poetry introduced the mythology of Homer and Hesiod into her pantheon. The characters and attributes of these deities were totally different from those of Greece. No licentious sexual activity disgraced their worship. They were defiled by none of the vices of the Greek religions. Saturn, Janus, Silvanus, Faunus, and other Etruscan deities were grave. They were sober, serious, venerable. They were respectable, honorable, pure, and delighted in the simple occupations of rural life. So there was a difference in the Etruscan religion and the Greek religion. The Greek religion can be considered immoral in many senses. The gods often committed terrible deeds, were immoral and so on, whereas the Etruscan deities were more honorable ideas of gods. It was only general features of resemblance which enabled the poets in later ages to identify Saturn with Kronos, Silvanus with Pan, the prophetic Kamenai of the Janiculum with the muses of Parnassus. The point, however, most important for the present consideration is that their language, likewise, was permanently affected. Note that the main idea of that paragraph is summed up in that final sentence. The ethnical affinities, the likenesses between the ethnic groups, that is, which have been here briefly stated and which may be considered as satisfactorily established by the investigations of modern scholars, Niebuhr, Muller, Lepsius, Donaldson, and others, are a guide to the affinities of the Latin language and point out the elements of which it is composed. These elements then are Umbrian, which, remember, according to tradition, may have been a pre-flood people, Oscan, Etruscan, Sabine, and Pelasgian. Those are the ethnic groups that were in early Italy and which were the sources of the ideas and rites, ceremonies, culture, religion, language of old Roman language. But as has been stated, the Etruscan language was a compound of Oscan and Pelasgian, and the Sabine was the link between the Umbrian and the Oscan. Therefore, the elements of the Latin are reduced to three, namely Umbrian, Oscan, and Pelasgian. So there are three main ethnic sources of the Latin language. Umbrian, which again, very fascinating because they were considered an antediluvian or pre-flood people. Oscan and Pelasgian. And remember, the Pelasgians were the people who had moved across the sea from Lydia or from Asia Minor, a more eastern people. These may again be classified under two heads, the one which has and the other which has not a resemblance to Greek. All Latin words which resemble Greek are Pelasgian, and all Latin words which do not resemble the Greek language are Oscan and Umbrian. Very interesting. All Latin words that resemble Greek words, Greek language, are Pelasgian in origin, and all which do not are Oscan and Umbrian. From the first of these classes, Pelasgian, must of course be accepted those words, such for example as triclinium, etc., which are directly derived from Greek, the origin of which dates partly from the time when Rome began to have intercourse with the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia, partly since Greek exercised an influence on Roman literature. It is clear from the testimony of Horace, a Roman poet, that the enriching of the language by the adoption of such foreign words was defended and encouraged by the literary men of the Augustan age, and the chapter closes with a quote from the poetry of Horace. So we'll stop there. That's the end of the first lesson, and we're at about 53 minutes, so just about an hour, which is our goal for these lessons. But just to sum up this first lesson, I know the history can get obscure and dense at times as you read through it. You've got to learn to develop the discipline to just keep reading. Look up words you don't recognize. Look up names you're not familiar with. You can use the chat bot on the Academy website to do this. As you'll see, it can help with some of these things. But the main point of this first chapter is that the Latin language of Roman literature, which we're studying in this course, we compared it to Greek language and Greek literature. So that's the first important thing to notice, the comparison between the Latin language and the Greek language. Make sure you study until you're somewhat familiar with the similarities and differences between the two languages. And then when we look at the history of the Latin language, we learned that there are three main divisions or three main periods of Roman literature or Latin literature. One extended from the earliest times of Italian civilization up to the time of Ennius. The second from the time of Ennius to the time of Plautus and Terence. And then the third age, the Golden Age, as it were, from that time to the time of Cicero and the Augustan poets like Horace, who we just heard about here at the end of the chapter. So there's three divisions or periods of Roman literature we learned about. And then we focused on the first period, the most ancient period, and we asked, where did this Latin language come from? And we learned a little bit about the history of early Italy and the settling and the wrestling for control of the peninsula there in Italy. We learned about a number of different groups of people, the names of which you should become familiar with. We learned about Etruscans. We learned about Umbrians. We learned about Oscans, Sicily, Pelasgians, and so on. Make sure that you jot those names down and understand at least what they're referring to as you study this chapter. And then we saw that as these people were both separate and mixing together, a Latin language began to develop that had two sources of influence on it. One was Pelasgian, which was Greek in its character, and the other was a combination of Oscan and Umbrian. And these different sources came together to give us what might be considered the Old Roman language. So a lot of information in that first chapter. Make sure you study it carefully, reread it. Make sure that if you write a summary or outline for the chapter, you at least have one important point from every paragraph. Make sure you understand these main topics, because when I review the assignments, I'm going to be looking for proof that you have studied and understand these things, especially the things that I've emphasized in the reading here in this talk. But that's going to be all for this first lesson. And remember, our goal is just to become familiar with the earliest form of Roman language and literature, to understand how it developed, the character that it had, so that we can use that knowledge to get into that ancient Roman literature and understand something of it. Not that any of it is necessarily available to us, but as we get into later literature, I think the first thing we actually read might be Plautus. So as we get into the second period, we'll have an idea of where Roman language actually came from, and we'll understand how this tradition, how this history then develops the culture of this Roman people, of this Italian people, and we'll be able to understand characters and places and ideas that we find expressed in literature. So make sure you read this first chapter carefully on your own. Use this talk to help you to focus on the main points. And as you complete the assessment, work to prove your careful study of the lesson and get that submitted so we can move forward together in this study of Roman literature. I hope you find that walk through the lesson helpful. If you have any questions, please get in touch with me. I'm happy to help. God bless your studies.